Hello and welcome to another one of my thoughts videos. In this one I want to progress on from modern shamanism and give you a really big example of that situation where modern medicine can actually be acting very much like witch doctors and be entirely wrong for all the technology and advancements we have in medicine and science, how wrong on some things they can be. Now, with all this world quarantining, I have been rather curious. As you know, being curious sets you on the path of finding out things, and I did a lot of research to gather some knowledge and get some understanding on what's been going on. I had a couple of concepts that are foundational to this. Now, the first concept that got me thinking is the difference between dead and alive. That is the first concept to look at. Now, it's very important to know the difference between something that is dead and something that is live. An analogy that I really liked someone saying is that a cat and a marshmallow. A cat is alive, it can do all sorts of things. A marshmallow just sits there. The situation with these bichos, these things that we're looking at for the reason for the quarantine, they're dead. They're like the marshmallow. They're not like the cat. In a normal cell, we have mitochondria, nucleus, and introplasmic reticulums, and a whole bunch of things that make it alive. That cell has a certain amount of autonomy, and something like an amoeba or other single-celled organisms have mobility. They have decision making. They have all sorts of different things that makes them alive. This particle that we're looking at that's causing all this quarantining is something that is dead. It has no life. And it's something that I had me thinking about for a long time of how can something be dead cause so many problems? I know that there are substances that are toxic that can make that happen, that if you have strychnine or some poison or something like that, ingest it and it will kill you because those chemical properties will make you die because it interrupts your chemical processes in your body. But this thing is actually what they consider to be like an organism and can travel from one person to another and that sort of thing, and have genetic material. Now, I have never ever heard of any situation other than that where genetic material can kill someone. Yes, a bacteria or a fungi or some organism like that can attack, and usually it's not, in some situations the actual organism attacks the body and eats something up, but in the majority of cases they spit out toxins, and it's the toxins that tend to kill us. So there was this big question for me. Why? Why is a thing that is inert dead, and how is it able to do anything? That's your first concept that you need to ponder on this. How can something that is dead act as if it's alive, but it's not? Another thing that had me thinking and wondering was replication. How does this thing reproduce, and how does that affect everything? Now, the replication concept is a very important one to consider because this gives a lot of information. They say that this organism or this thing is only goes into our cells, tricks the body into using the mechanisms or the machinery of our cells to replicate itself, and that is its basic function. Now, the question you have to ask in replication is, if the only place for it to replicate, it has no machinery of its own to replicate with, so it uses the cell's machinery to replicate with, then where did the original organism thing come from? If there is no other place on the planet outside of the body that it can replicate, the only place it can come from and originate is from your own body. And this also goes for other animals and plants as well that have the same. They can only do that. The only other option is that it's been artificially manipulated, and that's something that is quite viable these days. But originally, 150 years ago, 100 years ago, when they were studying this sort of thing, this was, we didn't know about or didn't have the ability to gene splice and all that sort of thing to be able to take one of these things and have it enter our bodies. Now we are able to do that. But that aside, think about that concept. There is nowhere on the planet that it can replicate and could have originated from except our own body. They only last a few hours outside of our body. Sunlight disintegrates them, heat disintegrates them, and humidity affects their ability to replicate otherwise, and also destroys them as well. So outside of the body, they are destroyed, and the only place that they can ever replicate is our own body. So the only place they could have come from in the beginning is from our own body. That is a major thing to consider. They come from our own body in the first place. They cannot exist anywhere else. Now, a bacteria or a fungi or any other organism have mechanisms to bridge the gap between getting from one host to another host. They can go into spores, they can hibernate, they can dry out and still survive, some can freeze and still survive, and some can some can photosynthesize while they find another host, and some can take reserves with them to do that. This particle thing, has none of these abilities. Once it is outside the body, it will disintegrate. There is no bridging mechanism to be able to get to another host, except if it's done quickly and like it is there. There is some spread, but they're not designed to last for long outside of our body. So therefore, the conclusion of that concept is they come from our own body, exist and replicate in our own body. There is no boogeyman of them coming from outer space or from another animal, whatever, unless they're manipulated by men. They are our own product. So after considering that these things are dead, they are not alive, they don't have autonomy or intellect, as it were, they're just dead objects, and that they come from our own body, they originate from our own body and can transfer from one to another. After considering that, I said, right, okay, what is the history of this particle thing? And this is where the shamanism really comes in. Now, 100 to 150 years ago, the scientists were having difficulties with a disease that was infecting, I think, potato crops, according to Wikipedia. And they managed to take the juice and filter out any bacteria or fungi, which is quite impressive for those days. The resulting liquid, they found, was able to infect other plants and make them sick. They automatically assumed, very shamanistically, that there was an organism smaller than a bacteria that was causing the damage. They did not consider that there was a toxin being produced by the bacteria or fungi. They dried this liquid into a white crystal powder and found that the powder was able to infect other plants as well. We know now that if there was one of these organism particle things that is causing quarantines these days, then it would have been destroyed by the drying process. So there was no organism in their first studies, but they coined the word to explain that, which basically means an unknown organism, poison thing. Go forward a little bit further, and they had the same problem with foot and mouth disease and continued research into this scientific new area. Fast forward once again, and you get to the to the epidemic of the influenza epidemic of 1918, and they will say that that was caused by these particles, these organism particles, but it turns out that it was bacterial, and anything that you research, they will openly admit it's bacterial, but still place the blame squarely and call it an epidemic of this kind. So they were wrong there, it was bacterial. Polio was another problem in those days, and they also considered that it was possibly some of these particle things as well, and so they started doing research. One researcher who managed to get a Nobel Prize for his work got some cells and cultured them in the lab, and then got some tissue from the infected polio person and put it into the dish, and they died. But what is not pointed out at that time, I don't know whether people were too scared to confront a Nobel Nobel winner or not, but it's been pointed out since then that his sterilization methods to sterilize the lab tissue in the first place was what was killing the tissue, not the particle things that we're talking about. And it turns out that since then there has been great suspicion placed on, and almost conclusive, that it was DDT at the time when they started spraying with DDT that was causing neurological problems, causing breaks in the spine and causing paralysis in people. And so that one has also been shamanistic in its sort of way. Fast forward a little bit further, and all of this time they were assuming something that they could not see, because microscopes weren't precise enough to see anything of that size, because it's like just a pinhead on the size of a basketball at least, or something like a kitchen table size comparison between one of these small particles and a bacteria. So they couldn't see them until they got electron microscopes, which came in the 50s, 60s, somewhere around there, when I was born sort of thing. They came into play, and they started studying these things. But what has been pointed out since then also is that they could not get accurate pictures of these things, because the electrons being fired at these things were so hostile it was destroying their object that they were trying to look at. In the 1980s, 85 thereabouts, someone speculated that there was the existence of something that the body was producing which was extremely small, but they didn't have microscopes better than the electron microscopes to investigate that. And it wasn't until the 1990s that they managed to develop a microscope which does not destroy the object to the same degree as the electrons. If you look on YouTube, exosomes, and a woman gives a TED talk, TEDx possibly, the first lady to photograph these exosomes, and she'll tell you about the development of that microscope. And so the area of exosome study was started. By 2005, things had ramped up to the degree that all the big guys like the CDC and ultra-rich people started to invest multi-millions of dollars into this area of science, and it became an official science area. They now have an association of exosome studies of America, and when they have a conference, there's up to 200 people attending it. So it suddenly became a new area of study. Now, what this new area of study found, that our cells, under certain circumstances or just all the time, produce these little packages with information in. They're sort of like a FedEx system. You get an envelope and you put whatever you like in it, whether it be genetic material, RNA, DNA, proteins, and all sorts of things like that. They found that they not only communicate, they also can eat toxins, and they just go out of the cell and surround a toxin that they've been told to go and look for because of what's in their envelope, and are able to consume those toxins. It's a very interesting sort of thing, and they're finding what they're made of, how they act, how they react, what's inside them, the DNA that they sometimes transport, and all these sorts of things. Now, the interesting thing is that you have this area that's new, and they found that every single aspect of what they thought these other particle organism things are these exosomes. I've watched a video by the president of the Exosome Association of America the other day, about an hour long, and at about 40 minutes, if you find him, about 40 minutes, he states that the HIV supposed organism thing in every single way is the same as an exosome. It has the same covering, it has the same mechanisms of entry and exit to the cell, it has the same proteins, it's the same size, it's the same look. They are essentially the same. Now, take it back to what I was saying in the beginning. My two concepts that you want to look at first is dead alive and reproduction or replication. Replication, they're exactly the same thing. It's a communication device that the body manufactures. They're dead. They are not alive. They're like FedEx packages or drones that have limited function and carry messages between cells to be able to get the body to do, and those cells to do things on a long distance. They found that in one study that with cancer cells, breast cancer cells, that when they subjected the cells to some chemotherapy chemical, I think tyrosol or something that starts with T, I think, one of the common ones, the first ones you put on, the cancer cells emit loads of exosomes, which then float over to the nearest cells and tells those that there is a toxin around, and those cells become immune to the chemotherapy, and they recognize that there is chemotherapy immunity. And that happens how? One cell recognizes a pathogen, a toxin, and tells the other cells through these exosomes so that they also can become resistant. So chemotherapy actually defeats its own purpose. It doesn't work. And so here we have the final roundup. These particle things that we're talking about that are dead don't actually exist. It's been a shamanistic supposition for about 150 years. They're exosomes produced by our own bodies for functions within our bodies. And it also, you can transfer them from one person to another, like the cancer cell. If a person comes in contact with a new toxin, whether it be electromagnetic things or any kind, our body will produce these exosomes to combat that threat. And any of those that transfer through spit or close contact with others close to us in the herd will give their body a head start in also alerting their cells how to combat this new threat. So you can see the humongously large scam that has happened over exosomes, something our body produces for our own benefit. Now, I've heard by various sources that this worldwide quarantining scam was being planned as far back as 2005, certainly by 2010. This roughly coincides with the input when the big financiers found out about exosomes and started pouring millions of dollars into it. They've had a 15-year head start of us, and it's important that they do their scam now before the rest of the world catches on to their big scam that these particle organism things that have been doing for 100 and 150 years is all a scam, and they're trying to get ahead to see how they can manipulate these things and how they can develop all sorts of things to try and get ahead of you and me. So it'll be interesting things to see. All of their jabbing you with a needle sort of thing is a scam because it doesn't work, and there's nothing. How are you going to combat your own body? Having exosomes in your body and saying that they cause diseases, it's like saying that whenever you see a fire engine, fire engines cause fires. They don't. They're a response. And these organism things are a response to any attack on or threat on the body. It's up to the medical profession and the scientists to figure out what these threats are and how to combat them, and not be lazy and shamanistic and blame it on some invented boogeyman and then use it to scam the entire world.